Howdy, friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
You let me go. You don't, I swear I'll cut you in two.
No, you won't, Billy boy. Not unless you jack that saddle gun. That's my Winchester you got. You pump around into it, did you? 'Cause you didn't. You got a hammer hanging over an empty chamber. I shot myself in the leg once, riding. Never carried around under the pin since.
You're lying.
There's one way to find out. Pull the trigger. That's if you think you have time to jack that gun before I blow your brains out. Now go ahead, Billy, pull. Or ain't you used to killing a man from the front?
That was a scene from the 1959 classic Ride Lonesome, one of many westerns you'll hear about on this episode of How the West Was Cast. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernoff, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now, for today's show, we've got something a little different in store for you. Rather than discuss one specific film or filmmaker, we're instead presenting a conversation between our very own Andrew Patrick Nelson and the esteemed film critic Joe Leydon. The subject is a list of the 100 greatest westerns ever made that Joe recently revised and edited for Cowboys and Indians Magazine. Originally published in 2002, the newly updated list features some fascinating inclusions and exclusions, and during this episode we'll find out why certain titles made the cut and why others didn't. It's a peek behind the editorial curtains at one of the most influential and highly respected publications devoted to Western culture. And with that said, we hope you enjoy our discussion with Joe Leydon.
All right. So, Joe Leydon is a longtime movie critic for Daily Variety and has also written for dozens of other major publications and media outlets, including the LA Times, Newsday, Film Comment, and the New York Daily News. He's a founding member of the Houston Film Critics Society and a lecturer at the Jack J. Valenti School of Communications at the University of Houston. But listeners of this podcast are most likely to know Joe as a senior writer for Cowboys and Indians Magazine, where he writes about all things related to Western film and television. Joe Leydon, welcome to How the West Was Cast.
Glad to be here, and I'm always glad to be referred to as senior writer. It makes me feel like I should be like Walter Brennan or Gabby Hayes, you know. Well, I'll tell you, young'uns, how the Westerns used to be in the old days.
Yeah. Well, on that note, the occasion for our conversation today is the publication of your list of 100 best Westerns ever made in the July 2021 issue of Cowboys and Indians, still on newsstands as we speak. Now, I'll say up front, I guess that I like this list a lot. It covers nearly 120 years of Western movie history, includes nearly all of the major actors, filmmakers, periods, cycles, trends. And I'd say for anyone looking to recommend an introduction to friends, the top 10 or 20 films on this list are a perfect place to start. I think also more seasoned fans are likely to discover new titles to watch, especially some lesser known but excellent films from the 50s and 60s. Now, this is not the first time that Cowboys and Indians has published a list of top 100 Westerns. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of the list and why 2021 was the right time to update it?
Well, David Hofstede did the original list for the magazine about 20 years ago. And it's been, you know, an enduringly popular article. We put it on our website to be available on the internet a few years ago. And it consistently, scores a lot of hits. But about a year or so ago, my editors and I were talking about doing a sort of a revision of the list for a couple of reasons. One, of course, 20 years have passed, and there have been, some other Westerns, some, actually very impressive Westerns that have been made. But also, Hofstede's original list included Western TV shows. and miniseries. And we decided that it would be more fair to sort of take out the TV element and put that into its own list to, honor and respect great TV Westerns and miniseries, which is, here's a spoiler, folks, that list will be coming out next year, and we'll be hyping the bejeepers out of that. And within the past year, of course, during lockdown, I went back and reviewed a lot of Westerns, a lot of classic Westerns and not so classic Westerns. And I kept the bare bones, more than the bare bones, of Hofstede's original list. But I did some revisionist inserting and, loring and raising of individual films. I would think that we're going to discuss, I'm sure, my choice for number one film in a little bit. But I think, oddly enough, the most important revision, the two most important revisions I made is I got a Bud Bedecker Western with Randolph Scott, Ride Lonesome. Bedecker's Westerns were not, represented in the original list. And I think Ride Lonesome is one of the all-time great Westerns. I mean, you were talking about showing a Western to somebody to introduce them to the genre. I think Ride Lonesome ranks high in that list of, your gateway drug, if you will. And also The Hired Hand, Peter Fonda's film, which is, one of my favorite Westerns of all time. And I think has, held up very well over the years.
Yeah, that was one of the Hired Hand was one of the big surprises, wonderful surprises to me. So maybe I'll save that one for a few minutes from now. But with the Randolph Scott, the Bud Bedecker pictures, I mean, that points to an interesting fact that as much as new Westerns have been made since 2002, I think that Bedecker Scott box set, the DVD box set, didn't come out into the late 2000s. So it's not just that new Westerns are being made, it's just the accessibility of some older Westerns has improved over the course of the last 2 decades.
Oh, definitely. I can remember several years ago when I believe it was Turner Classic Movies did a tribute to the Bedecker Westerns with Randolph Scott. And this even ranked a feature story, the Los Angeles Times, pointing out, he's kind of forgotten now, but look at these great, works of art that this pair made. And I was fortunate enough to do a telephone interview with Mr. Bedecker some years back, and he's quite a salty character, talking about how he cast certain movies, and the idea that you look at Ride Lonesome and there's Pernell Roberts years before Bonanza, and I've had people tell me this, and I have to agree with them. You see Pernell Roberts in this movie standing toe-to-toe with Randolph Scott, and you wonder how Pernell Roberts didn't become a major movie star. Right. I mean, in this film, he has all the charisma of The Rock, and I mean that as a compliment. And, James Coburn, who came on in a supporting role, and Bedecker told me that, it was Randolph Scott who came up to him and said, "Hey, this boy's got something. Why don't you give him some more dialogue?" And Bedecker agreed, so he did. And, the relationship between those two quote-unquote supporting players, Pernell Roberts and James Coburn, would be enough to sell this movie, I think.
Yeah. Well, the Bedecker films are interesting in that respect. I mean, I also think of Richard Boone in The Tall T, who more than holds his own against Randolph Scott, but who also, we know really from television now, where he was a leading man.
Bedecker told me a funny story about Richard Boone that he wanted to cast Boone, right away. And at the time, Richard Boone was best known for the TV series Medic, which was an early doctor show. And the producers were kind of wary of this. And they said, we don't think he could be funny enough because, that role does call for some, rather salty humor. And so Bedecker called up Boone and said, "Look, I really want you for the movie, but, they questioned whether you can do comedy." And Boone was kind of distressed at the time because his wife was undergoing tests for cancer. Thank God she didn't have it. And Boone said, well, and I'm going to clean this up here. Boone said, well, I thought those operations I did, on Medic were pretty freaking funny. And with that, Mediker said, okay, yeah, look, I'm casting you. I don't care what anybody says.
Wedding bells turn into a funeral march, and Heck Ramsey is out for revenge. Richard Boone stars on NBC Sunday Mystery Movie at 8:30, 7:30 Central Time.
So in terms of the process for compiling the list, so you have the original list. Have you at the magazine received feedback from readers or even actors or filmmakers over the years telling you this list is wrong?
Well, over the years since Hofstede's original list has come out, people have said, well, what about this? What about that? What about the other thing? Usually it's been in reference to a movie that, was made or released after the originals, but some other people, calling attention to Mediker movies, some other films. But it's funny, since this new list has come out, we've got the overwhelmingly positive reaction, but also some people have submitted their own lists. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, people who love Westerns, and yes. We've been very happy and pleased with the response. And it may be another 20 years before we update the list again, but sure. that would depend on do they keep making good Westerns, to add to the list.
Right.
Of course, and as you point out, there are Westerns that we may have forgotten or overlooked that, are newly released on Blu-ray and DVD and are available for streaming. And, they may be worthy of a second look.
Well, it seems to me that the mark of a good list of this type is the fact that it does engender a certain passionate response, either positive or negative. Obviously, I'm guessing there are concerns about unexpected inclusions and conspicuous omissions, and then I suppose controversies about how high or low a particular film might be ranked, especially relative to other films. I mean, I would hope most of that squabbling isn't about whether a film is 89 or 90 or 90th, but certainly in that top 20. And so to that point, the biggest surprise to me was that you have ranked Stagecoach #1 ahead of The Searchers at #2. As many people know, over the past 20 years or so, The Searchers has earned a reputation as the greatest Western and one of the greatest films of all time. So can you talk a little bit about why Stagecoach is in fact the greater Western, if only slightly greater?
Well, that's a good question. And going back to, my diverse background, the idea that in addition to writing for Cowboys and Indians Magazine, being a critic for Variety, I have taught film studies courses for the past 20 years at University of Houston's Jack J. Valenti School of Communications. And I approached compiling this list as a Western fan, Western geek, first and foremost, but also as an educator. Because, you said right at the start, this is a list that you might want to show people who are not into Westerns. And amazingly enough, teaching in Texas, I found, sometimes when I show a Western to a class, whether it be Stagecoach or The Searchers or Rio Bravo, there will be students in class who have never seen a Western before.
Yeah.
Never. And like I say, I'm not talking about exchange students because, I've had students from Cameroon who think John Wayne is, the boss. He's cool.
Yeah.
And the more I thought about it, the more I thought The Searchers is a great movie. It's a classic, but it's more of a Western for people who are already well-versed in Westerns. I think, not taking anything away from the film, but, to see the cliches and conventions that Wayne and John Ford were questioning, were giving a second thought to, not to be woke, I mean, nobody was woke, I think, in the 50s yet. But the idea that this archetypical character that Wayne played maybe wasn't an unadulterated hero. Maybe we could question his actions, his motives. Stagecoach, to me, is like the blueprint for almost every Western ever made after 1939. Mm-hmm. You have the archetypical characters, you have the conflict, you have the idea of the guy who'd like to put his guns away and maybe settle down with this tarnished lady. But, a man's got to do what a man's got to do. And there's there's the battle with Indians. There's the climactic shootout in town. And I always go back to the fact that, famously Orson Welles said that he looked at Stagecoach something like a dozen times before he directed Citizen Kane. He said this was the greatest film school he could have ever possibly, hoped to attend. And also, Stagecoach is a remarkable film in that we tend to remember Westerns, I think, for their outdoor scenes, for the shootout on Main Street, for riding across the plains. And Stagecoach, of course, has all of that. But it's also, in many ways, a very intimate story. Most of the scenes are interiors, and most of them are as moodily lit as a film noir. So, I mean, it is almost a mini history of movies, not just Western movies, but movies itself. And look, this is the movie where you have the camera rushing up to embrace John Wayne. And, people often talk about, okay, this is the role that made somebody a star. That, to me, is the shot, the individual shot that made John Wayne a star. So for all those reasons, and I mean, not that much higher than The Searchers, but I think the case could be made, yes, a little bit higher.
So I take your point. I think The Searchers is the greatest Western, but it's also my favorite movie. But then when I'm asked to recommend Westerns, I'm usually hesitant to say that The Searchers is the Western you should see as an introduction. And I think your point is the right one, that, and you write this in the piece, that it's not like, oh, these archetypes didn't exist before Stagecoach, but the film kind of perfects and crystallizes them. Whereas The Searchers is more of an intervention into that tradition that then sort of builds on everything that's come before and then influences everything that's come after. So I think that's a really productive way of looking at the difference between the two. I mean, we can fight about this at the bar later, I suppose, but I buy your reasoning.
And like I say, I mean, it's a list that I hope people don't think of me as, thinking of myself as Moses coming down from the mountaintop with the 2 stone tablets and say, no, you gotta listen to this. Because, I mean, it's like you said, when you get down to like, is something 37 or 38 or 64 or 65. I mean, you want to cast your net wide. Yeah. And it's funny. It's a very subjective thing. Now, I know for a fact that you have in your office a poster for the movie Big Jake.
Right behind me.
And I can remember when Big Jake came out in theaters. Yes, I'm that old. And I actually reviewed it. And to me, it was a very routine, very, formulaic, and most of the other critics who reviewed it at the time treated that. A good deal of them treated it as even worse.
Yes.
And I think I remember reading somewhere that one of John Wayne's ex-wives or something just dismissed just about every film he did after True Grit as, basically the same movie over and over again in the same part of Mexico. I think that's a little harsh. But Big Jake, over the years, is a handful of movies I've noticed that, people now love that movie. You cannot say anything bad about Big Jake.
Sure.
You cannot question that it was one of John Wayne's greatest movies. And, everybody has, an opinion on this sort of thing. If I can digress for just a moment.
Sure.
Years ago, I was on a junket for a movie starring Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds, years earlier, had made a movie called Heat, not the Al Pacino, Robert De Niro movie, a movie based on a William Goldman novel, and it was dreadful. I mean, and Reynolds would make fun of it for years afterwards, and it was one of these films that, one director came in and then left, and then another, I mean, it was just disaster. Okay, so we're in a group of in a hotel room, there like maybe 6 or 7 of us. And we're all getting up to leave. And one guy says, I just want to tell you, Heat is one of my favorite movies of all time. And leaves. And I mean, he wasn't being snarky. He wasn't being sarcastic. I mean,
Sincere.
And Reynolds just sat there and looked around at the rest of us. And he obviously didn't want to make fun of the guy. But he just looked at us and went, Heat? So I find myself, I mean, I'm not comparing myself to Burt Reynolds, but I mean, it's just, there are times when we will get responses to Facebook posts, or I'll get emails, and I'll say, how dare you say that this wasn't so-and-so's best movie of all time, or one of his great, it's like,
right.
Okay.
Well, that's the thing I tell students about movies, that, the movie is one component of a relationship, and you're the other component of that. So you're going to respond in a way that's personal to you, and it's going to be affected by who you are and where you saw it at that moment in time. And those are things that critics or scholars just can't quantify or even really qualify. But that's one of the magical things about movies, that we do have these relationships with them. So that guy can look at a terrible film and it can mean something. It can mean the world to him, and that's great.
Burt Reynolds is back.
Could you tell me something about yourself, please?
And he's hotter than ever before. In Las Vegas, you've got to be tough.
They're coming to kill you, asshole.
Burt Reynolds. Heat.
So let me ask you about another film that's ranked pretty high. Dances with Wolves is in the top 10 at number 9, ahead of Unforgiven at 21, ahead of Tombstone at 24. And I mentioned those as being films from that important 90s cycle. Also ahead of The Wild Bunch at number 10. Now, my perception is that Dances with Wolves has not necessarily aged as well as some of the other 90s Westerns. But you make the case that it's really an important film with respect to the representation of Native Americans. So why Dances with Wolves so high?
Well, again, and this goes into another area that only within, I guess, the past couple of decades, with film lovers and film scholars have had to struggle with. What version of Dances with Wolves are you talking about?
Yeah, 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah, and the epic, full director's cut version of Dances with Wolves is a very amazing piece of work. It does hold up. And yes, it does give the Native Americans in the cast, the characters, more than their due, or their just due, I should say. And that was actually the way the ranking was on Hofstede's original list.
Really?
And to this day, whenever we run anything in the magazine or on the website about Dances with Wolves, there's this flood of, oh, yes, my all-time favorite movie.
Yeah.
And again, Dances with Wolves, Wild Bunch, I'm at number 11 is The Outlaw Josie Wales. I'm sure there are people out there who'd say, no, that's better than both of those movies.
Sure.
So it's kind of an arbitrary thing. I'm the first to admit, but.
Well, I think that just including it, that high is interesting to me because in, say, academic circles, that film has been criticized for its very over-sentimental portrayal of, unhistorical portrayal of indigenous peoples. But I think it's useful to bear in mind that there are different audiences looking at this film in different ways, and that could be one of the most popular films among fans of the Western.
Oh,
and
yes.
That counts for something.
Well, it's funny. There are people who, including Kevin Costner, thought the success of that film would lead to sort of a renaissance of the Western.
Yeah.
And of course, he did get to make, another great Western, Open Range. And of course, it won the Academy Award. And so did Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. But, funny thing happened. They still make Westerns.
Sure.
And every so often they make a really good Western that isn't just bound for, the red box kiosk, which is not to, say anything bad about red box kiosks. I use them all the time. I have one of those frequent renter cards. Yeah. But again, a movie may get a certain critical response in its time.
Yes.
And then over years, the luster may diminish, but the luster may grow even brighter.
Right.
Number 17 on the list, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Now, you talk about a movie that was treated like a plate of leftovers when it came out.
Yep.
Pauline Kael just sort of, get out of here with this, And, I kind of got the impression that even Ford himself didn't think he was making anything special, at the time. And then over a period of years, though, on anybody's list of great Westerns, Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is at least going to be in the top 20.
Yeah, I think for many people, that's the kind of the Rosetta Stone that helps us understand what the Western is, or at least was to that point. There's no question about that appreciation in value over time.
Out of the flame and fury of the frontier, the Old West lives again as only John Ford can recreate it. Peopled with wonderful characters who have become legend in their own time. Of them all, two are the most memorable: Liberty Valance and The Man Who Shot Him.
It is funny. I can remember when the spaghetti westerns were first popular. And there were critics who were treating Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood like they committed war crimes.
Yeah.
This is violent. This is operatic. This is, and, flash forward several decades. And now people say, oh, I'd like to see a traditional Western like The Good, the Bad, the Ugly.
Bad and the Ugly, yeah.
And I like to see an old-fashioned Western like A Fistful of Dollars. And, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I saw a documentary years and years ago about the making of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. And the director, George Roy Hill, pointed out that the reviews for this movie were not very good. And no. In fact, if he would have been like a Broadway-bound show, it would have closed during out-of-town tryouts, because if it got that kind of, critical response. Well, the audience spoke.
Yeah, it's a word-of-mouth success.
I grew up in New Orleans, and it played at the Orpheum Theater for the better part of like half a year, back when a movie would play that long in a first-run engagement. And now, when we did a piece a few years ago, 1969, maybe the last great year for Westerns, not saying there haven't been great Westerns made since then, but the idea that, that was the last year where there were so many Westerns being made and so many Westerns on TV. And, so I went back and researched Butch Cassidy, and it reminded me when I was in college, me and a couple of my roommates went to the Orpheum that night to see Butch Cassidy, and, they were sneak previewing another film. And it turned out to be The Undefeated, John Wayne
and Rock Hudson.
Now, you cannot get two more different approaches to the Western genre than John Wayne and Rock Hudson, or Paul Newman and Robert Redford. The thing is, after 69. And you point this out in that terrific exhibit you've got in the museum in San Antonio right here. You could do your little plug there.
Yeah, Still in the Saddle, the new history of the Hollywood Western. Thank you.
Yes, and it's still going on, So, but the idea that John Wayne was making movies like Big Jake and things well into the 70s. And there were other very traditional Westerns still being made. But it was also a time when there was a revisionist approach to Westerns. I mean, 69, you had The Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You had, this plethora of movies about cowboy heroes getting involved somehow in the Mexican Revolution. And then, the spaghetti Western cycle was still going on. So there's a roundabout way of making the point, the idea that, what we think of now as traditional and just emblematic, in their time, maybe weren't received that well by the traditionalists.
Right. Yeah, but over time, they get kind of assimilated into this broader canon. It's like realism in films. What counts as realistic is going to change. What's realistic to you won't be realistic to your kids. It's just changing aesthetic standards.
Paul Newman is Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid is Robert Redford. Most of this is true, and all of it blazes with action. You've never met a pair like Butch and Sundance.
So speaking of that moment you're talking about, just 1 year after, The Hired Hand, number 20. Now, Peter Fonda's excellent Western has its supporters out there, but it is rarely mentioned alongside the other celebrated Westerns of its ilk from the late 60s and 1970s. This is also a film that has benefited from home video releases over the past 20 years. What was the impulse to include this so prominently in the list?
Well, I first saw The Hired Hand when I was in college, and it was on a date. And the young lady and I enjoyed the film. We saw it at the Joy Theater in New Orleans. By the way, this is a side note, but I'm convinced that if you are of a certain age, you remember not only the movies, but you remember where you saw them.
Absolutely. I make this point all the time. And,
if you really stop and think, you can remember what day it was, and who you were in love with at the time and what was going on in your life. And, get back to your point about you see these films not only as art or entertainment, but they remind you of what was going on in your life the first time. So anyway, we walked out in the lobby. We decided we loved the movie. So we turned around and went back to watch it again. Wow. Which is like the only time I can ever remember doing that, either by myself or with somebody else. And again, The Hired Hand is, in some ways, a traditionalist Western, but it's also a revisionist Western. I mean, in many ways, it's the woman's film.
Yes.
It's the story of the woman who is left behind by this cowboy who goes off and, comes back and, well, she hasn't been patiently waiting for him. She's been living her life, and he has to earn her respect, earn her love again. And the idea of the Western at heart, and I think this is one of the things that make the Western, so enduringly popular. It part of it is the myth of anytime I don't like the way my life is going, I can take what I really need, put it in a saddlebag, throw it over my horse, and ride off to the next horizon, ride off to the next town, ride off to the next state, reinvent myself. Well, that's nice, but what about the responsibilities? What about the people you leave behind when you're doing this? And Peter Fonda's character tries to have it both ways. He comes home, but he brings along the guy he's been writing with for all these years, Warren Oates. And his wife tells him, look, he's known more of you than I have. and it'd be like almost like you brought a woman you met out during your travels and wanted to put her out in the barn or something like that. And, he doesn't deny it. And I don't want to give the game away for anybody who's not seen the film, but it is beautiful. It is heartbreaking. It was not available on television for a while, right. Even though this is a kind of a funny thing, getting back to what we were talking about, what version of the movie you're talking about. First time I saw it on NBC, Monday night at the movies. Now, keep in mind, I've already seen this movie like a zillion times in theaters. And I'm sitting down to watch it, and suddenly Larry Hagman pops up. What? Huh? And then there's another scene with Larry Hagman. He's the sheriff in town. And I'm thinking, okay, am I having an acid flashback here or something? I mean, what's going on here? Well, the first time I interviewed Fonda, I asked him, what gives that? Well, it turns out that he cut the movie before it was released. And it wasn't like the studio mandated it, but, he wanted to get it down to a reasonable level. Well, when it came on broadcast TV, they cut out, some of the references to the sexuality of Fonda's wife and, some violent scenes. And they still had to fill this 2-hour time slot. So they put back in stuff that had been discarded and left on the cutting room floor. And that was the version that was on television for years. I mean, when A&E first cranked up, they had a package of Universal Studios films, and that's the version that they had. Also, the soundtrack album was not available in this country until I think about 6 or 7 years ago. So the answer, roundabout way of answering your question, that may be why, there's some people who forget the film, or they forgot them seeing the film or whatever. And you're right. On home video, that sort of, elevated the film's visibility. And I think that's a great thing.
You don't have any right to come back this way. You think I can't send you away, think you're still married to me, but that ain't so. I don't want Janie upset. As far as she knows, her father is dead. I don't want you saying no different.
Look, Hannah, just let me work the place for a bit. Like a hired hand.
So how about we transition to some films that are not on the list? Probably, well, for some people, the most conspicuous absence, but one that I actually fully support, is McCabe and Mrs. Miller. McCabe and Mrs. Miller is generally regarded as a great, if not one of the greatest Westerns. I think it placed 8th in the AFI's 2008 poll, yet it does not appear in the CNI Top 100. It's the only film from the AFI Top 10 not included on this list. So what say you about the conspicuous absence of McCabe and Mrs. Miller from the greatest 100 Westerns?
Well, first off, Mr. Hofstede didn't have it on his original list either. So it wasn't like I just, tossed it out.
Yeah, precedent. Good.
I've always had problems with McCabe and Mrs. Miller.
All right. So have I, but I don't find many people willing to have that conversation. So what are your problems?
First off, even when I saw it in theaters, I can remember thinking I was having premature hearing loss because, and I know Robert Altman does the overlapping dialogue. I loved MASH, I just, in want of a better term, I've never gotten into that film. I've talking about Altman, I've never really shared the enthusiasm some of my peers have for The Long Goodbye. Mm-hmm. His approach to, the hard-boiled detective story.
Detective film, yeah.
I think Altman, I can't say he was condescending in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which I think he was in The Long Goodbye. I just, it might be number 120.
Yeah. Well, no, I always find that obviously Altman was doing a certain thing at that period, and that was revisiting many of the classical Hollywood genres with his own critical eye. But it always felt to me like sometimes he understood what he was criticizing, like MASH, mm-hmm. but then other times, like The Long Goodbye, like his two Westerns, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and Buffalo Bill and the Indians, or Sitting Bull's History Lesson. And even in Nashville, to a certain degree, he didn't necessarily understand what it was that he was criticizing. I probably feel that most strongly in McCabe and Mrs. Miller.
Well, Nashville, it's funny. I got to see Nashville in Nashville at the Belcourt Theater, one of the nation's great art houses. By the way, if you're ever in Nashville, you should go to the Belcourt Theater. And it was the 40th anniversary screen. They were having at the Belcourt a Nashville an Altman retrospective. What was funny is they also showed archival news footage of when Nashville premiered in Nashville decades earlier.
Right.
And you could tell that some of the locals were not happy with this film. You know, the folks who showed up for the premiere were being very polite and, you know, very ingratiating. I can see where some locals might have thought they were being, but it again, over the years, you know, there in Nashville, there was, you know, an overflow crowd.
Interesting.
To see this film. And the audience gave its full-throated roar of approval.
Wow.
For it. So, you know, to say everything old is new again. Well, sometimes many things that are old really are revisited and reevaluated.
Mm-hmm. Positively or negatively.
Right. Well, I mean, there are certain films that every time somebody does a story about, you know, really goofy picks for Best Picture by the, you know, Academy, the Oscars, usually Around the World in 80 Days, you know.
Right.
And I don't know if you've tried to sit through Around the World in 80 Days recently, but it's like you're stopped at a railroad, you know, crossing, and this very long train is going by and sometimes stops altogether, you know. On the other hand, you're talking about revisionist thought. I saw Giant back in the 80s again, and I couldn't help but think, Jesus, this thing is dated badly. I mean, it's so slow, and James Dean is doing his method acting thing. And well, around the time of the 50th, it was the 50th or the 60th anniversary of Giant, I went back and looked at it again. Damn, this is a great movie. I mean, this is really, you know, and you know, Giant, you know, was really the movie, I think, that began to change the perception of Texas as full of cowboys to a place where there were a lot of oil tycoons, and I mean, you could draw really a straight line from Giant to Dallas, you know, and other films and TV shows about, you know, Texas.
Yeah, because it's not as though there weren't, you know, earlier films or books that made the case that the West was, you know, really not as much about agriculture as it was about resources. The Virginian, I mean, the Virginian sees the Virginian go off to make his fortune in, let's say, in mining.
Yeah.
But that film, certainly in the popular consciousness, you know, Texans and oil.
Oh yeah, yeah. And we had to put Giant somewhere here on the list.
For best performance by an actress, the nominees are Janet Sussman for Nicholas and Alexandra, a Horizon Pictures production, Columbia. Julie Christie for McCabe and Mrs. Miller. A Robert Altman, David Foster production, Warner Brothers. Jane Fonda for Clute, a Gus production, Warner Brothers. Glenda Jackson for Sunday Bloody Sunday, a Joseph Janney production, United Artists. Vanessa Redgrave for Mary, Queen of Scots, a Hal Wallace Universal Pictures Limited production. May I have the envelope, please? The winner is Jane Fonda.
All right. So how about, here's another film that's not on the list. Johnny Guitar, perennial favorite of French film critics from the Cahiers cinema critics onward. No Johnny Guitar on the list.
That'd be like 105.
Okay.
It's funny. Johnny Guitar, which is, when you look at it from a, contemporary sense, and I wonder people who were looking at it back then were thinking, damn, this is one weird movie.
Yes.
And Mercedes McCambridge as, the town boss. Let's say that.
Shoot. Wears the pants.
Yeah. All dressed in black. And what's funny is I interviewed Mercedes McCambridge when she was out on a tour for her autobiography. And I asked her about Johnny Guitar. And she thought this was outrageous that people were reading all of these sexual,
lesbian suspect.
Yeah. No. I wasn't there at all. And I thought, well, if that's your story, ma'am, you should stick with it.
Well, there's no shortage of other Freudian Westerns. I was actually really pleased to see Warlock on the list, which is a favorite kind of revisionist take on Wyatt Earp of mine, where it's no less than Henry Fonda in 59 revisiting that character.
Well, you could almost make, well, not 100 movies, but a substantial list of movie depictions of Wyatt Earp. And was he a hero? Was he a villain? Was he a psychopath? Was he, this, that, thing? And, you look at, three vastly different, Doc, and then, Warlock, and Costner's performance in Wyatt Earp. And, I got into a conversation with James Garner some years ago about his performance.
Hour of the Gun,
which was kind of a sort of sequel to OK Corral, the gunfight.
Yes, Sturgis kind of goes back and says, okay, well, here's how it really happened.
Yeah.
Even though he said that back in 59.
Yeah. And it didn't last that long. And, maybe Wyatt Earp wasn't on the up and up setting this up and things like that. And Garner flat out, said, I think it's the most honest depiction of Wyatt Earp ever, because I think in many ways the guy was a cold-blooded killer. Well, like I do, Hour of the Gun was not exactly a resounding box office hit. And I think part of the reason for it, and the movie has some problems, but I like it a lot, But the idea that, maybe we don't want to hear that about Wyatt Earp. We would still, even after all these years. And I can remember seeing Tombstone when it first came out. And, we all know about the troubled production history of Tombstone. The original director had to be told to take a hike, and they brought in somebody else. But, it was Kurt Russell who was really
directed it.
And my first impression was I was seeing the longest coming attractions trailer ever made. That, the jumble of scenes is like, now I loved Val Kilmer's performance.
Yes,
and other things in the film. And it wasn't until years later when, again, there was, what version of the film are we talking about? And the director's cut, which has been available on home video for years. Okay, I wish this is the one that had been released in theaters, my opinion, And it wasn't like they put hours of footage back into the movie, but it flowed better. And I could see why people really, and again, that's a traditional Western. Well, I don't think a lot of this movie would have gotten past a production code back in the days. Some of the language, some of the, references to sexuality, some of the violence. But it's this whole idea of traditional. I got an email just today from a publicist for a country music artist. And he said, oh, yes, he's playing traditional country music of the 70s and 80s. And I like country music from the 70s and 80s, but I don't think a lot of diehard traditional country lovers would call that traditional. That was, the outlaw music and other things. And of course, now a lot of country music is pop influenced. And every time we run something in the magazine about the country music awards are coming up, that's not country. That's the kind of Facebook, response.
After they drop the Western. Well, I think we need to remember that, this isn't a new phenomenon either, that, critics of, the 1950s saw films like Shane as a lamentable move away from the classicism of a film like Stagecoach. And then over time, what counts as classic just gets bigger and bigger, and what was revisionist gets assimilated within what was traditional. And that's just the way it works.
Well, we were talking before about Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid.
Yeah.
Well, Goldman, looking back after the fact, William Goldman, who won
the screenwriter,
who won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay for Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, said one of the problems he had, or that people had with the movie is, and they complained that Butch and Sundance were not heroic. They spend most of the movie running away.
Well, he tells that famous story about, how there was this unnamed producer who, said he would buy the script if he would change the ending to have Butch and Sundance stand and fight. And then Goldman responds, well, they did run away. They ran away all the way to South America in real life. And the producer responds, it depends on the story, something to the effect of, I don't give a shit what they did. All I know is John Wayne don't run away.
Well, I'm sure you've heard the story when Wayne was making what turned out to be his final film, The Shootist. And apparently there was a scene where his character was supposed to shoot somebody in the back.
Yes.
And he complained to Don Siegel, and Siegel said, well, Clint Eastwood would shoot him in the back. Yeah. And that was not what John Wayne wanted to hear,
Well, yeah. John Wayne saying I guess the story, he says, I've made 200 pictures and never once shot a man in the back, with the exception of The Searchers and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Although I suppose you could make a case he shot Valance in the side.
Yeah, from a secluded corner of the main street there.
Very, very heroic.
It hits with all the violent elemental passions of a sandstorm. This story of a woman who lived and loved too hard and wanted too much, willing to fight any odds to get it.
Down there I sell whiskey and cards. All you can buy up these stairs is a bullet in the head. Now which do you want?
Starring Joan Crawford, the screen's most dynamic artist. Sterling Hayden as Johnny Guitar.
Last film that struck me as not on the list, and then I'll get on to some other questions here. So I'm a big fan of the great Delmer Daves as a filmmaker. So, love to see him getting some representation, 3:10 to Yuma and Cowboy. But no Broken Arrow, which some people would say is really the most influential film from that period for its depiction of American Indians. Was the lack of Broken Arrow a holdover from the old one?
Yeah. Actually. Okay. I mean, look, it sounds like I'm putting all of this blame on Hofstede, and I really don't mean to. But I mean, remember the original list also had Gunsmoke
TV
and Lonesome, Dove. So when I took those out and I was plugging them in with titles that I thought should be on any list of great westerns, but you raised some good points. I mean, who knows?
20 years from now, you and I could be having a very different conversation.
I hope to be around in 20 years to be having it.
All right. How about any films that just kind of missed the cut, or things you would have, if a few months later, if you could do it over, you might have put in?
That's hard because the further you get away from a movie.
Yeah.
I told you before, if you're of a certain age, you remember the theater you saw it at and everything. But there's some films that I, over a period of time, had automatically assumed were theatrical films, were actually made for cable films, made for video films. And there were a couple of titles that I immediately thought, oh, yes, I've got to put that on the list. Oh, no, that was Tom Selleck, and he was great, but that
TV.
was TNT, back when, Turner's people were making
the Conager films would be other examples, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Or I guess what was the one with Duvall? Broken Trail is the one that people confuse.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that had, Walter Hill directed it. It had theatrical production values, back in the day. But that was primarily, the thing that kind of, maybe I should have left TV movies. Because, you think about it, in the 80s and well into the 90s, I mean, it was television, cable TV.
Absolutely.
It was more or less keeping the genre alive. And some of these films are every bit as good as theatrical features, not all of them, but, and it's funny how, we'll have readers say, oh, I really wish Tom Selleck would make another Western. Now, Tom Selleck's a fine actor. I admire him very much. Tom Selleck now is older than John Wayne was when John Wayne died. So right. I think, he might have trouble getting into this. Of course, I would have trouble getting into
back in the saddle.
Yeah. And his movies, except for Quigley Down Under, which is on, the list.
It's on the list, yeah.
Were all made for video. I mean, I keep saying made for video, made for cable, made for television. And some of them were great films. But I don't think, who would you cast in a traditional quote unquote Western if it was being made today? I mean, somebody who, you would believe in On the Saddle.
Yeah, Kurt Russell is the first person to come to mind, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. And, there's Tommy Lee Jones.
Yeah, of course, sure.
And, you talk about Westerns. Tommy Lee Jones has got a movie coming out soon called The Comeback Trail.
Looks hilarious.
Which is a loose remake of a comedy that Buster Crabbe was in, during the 60s. And the plot is a broken down Western star is hired by these producers to make a movie. What he doesn't know is the producers actually want him to get killed during the film so they can collect on the insurance policy. And Robert De Niro is one of the producers. And Morgan Freeman is the gambler that the producer owns a lot of money to. And it's hilarious. I mean, but you have these three guys just slicing, the ham in generous chunks. I mean, they're over the top. But as I've said, it's a movie that'll make you laugh until you're thoroughly ashamed of yourself. And the idea that, here is Tommy Lee Jones, who could conceivably come back next year and be believable as, a cowboy star or leading a Western. But they would probably need to cast for box office insurance a younger lead. I mean, right. I know some people got bent out of shape over the Magnificent Seven remake.
Mm-hmm.
It was too politically correct. One of the more misguided criticisms of that film, of course, was that, they had a black guy in the lead. They didn't have black cowboys. I was like, well, and, you were asking, about, Unforgiven. Again, I can remember going on the junket for that. And we were in a room just about, 7 or 8 journalists, and we were sitting around Clint Eastwood. And some woman actually asked about this and said, why do you have a black cowboy in this film? I mean, was this something to be, and she didn't use the term politically correct because that term wasn't used, but something like right. that. And Eastwood just shot her a look, and you could see, the wheels turning in his head. It's like, that moment in The Professionals where Ralph Bellamy asked Lee Marvin, do you have any problems working with a Negro? And, Lee Marvin looks at him like, this is the dumbest, cracker I've ever met. Yeah. But Eastwood, very politely said, well, no, actually, there were a lot of black cowboys, and we were true to the spirit of the time. And then just went over to another question, like, I'm not wasting any more time with this blockhead,
Yeah, well, I'm sure Fred Williamson and Woody Strode would have something to say about all that.
And even John Ford, John Ford, not only Sergeant Rutledge, but, the man who shot Liberty Valance, made it very clear that there were indeed, black cowboys. And as you say, Woody Strode, second that motion.
Yeah. Or Herb Jeffries, if we want to go back to the 30s.
Buckaroo, yes.
The Bronze Buckaroo.
The Western. No other form of motion picture can match its power, its adventure, its drama. Now, 20th Century Fox presents a film that rides with the great westerns. Take a Hard Ride, starring Jim Brown as Pike, the loner. To some men, death is a way of life. Fred Williamson as Tyree, the gambler.
I certainly would call this a fine hand.
He could deal from the bottom of the deck or the barrel of a .45. Jim Kelly as the half-breed. He never said much. He never had to. Take a Hard Ride.
How about any other kind of interesting feedback you've received on the list about inclusions or exclusions?
Well, I mean, even though we make it clear, in the introduction that no TV miniseries, we've had. Well, what about Lonesome Dove?
Well, that I can imagine getting a lot about that because I think for many people there are people
touchstone, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with them, who think Lonesome Dove is the greatest Western ever made, period. End of sentence.
Yeah, I've met these people.
And I can see that. And again, if, now that it's, been restored and gussied up and, digitally this and that, and you watch it on a big screen TV, you think, yeah, this is the production values alone. I mean, this is as great as, shouldn't say this, but beats the hell out of Red River, and Robert Duvall in the role of a lifetime, and I think that's his favorite, of all time. Tommy Lee Jones, and you got a splendid supporting cast, and it has this epic sweep. But then again, it had 8 hours to tell the story, and it's kind of sort of unfair to compare Lonesome Dove to Stagecoach or even the Searchers, because they only had about 2 hours to tell their story.
Right. Yeah. Well, and now I suppose just something as simple as not necessarily watching it over 2 nights on CBS with a kind of strange cliffhanger involving a snake in the river. I mean, just the experience of watching it over time is very different than it was. Back in
at a time when the Western was considered passé, not posse, but
except on television, and as you point out.
The idea that this was a movie that just captured the imagination of folks. I mean, when the first night ratings rolled in, I mean, they were, popping champagne corks and giving everybody the high five over at CBS because it was a risk. Yeah. I mean, it's always funny when you go back and you talk to people who were involved, in something that you think of as a classic. And of course, this is something that, should have been accepted. This was a risk. I mean, this was not, and as I recall, it wasn't even shown during a sweeps month, when they booked, all of these audience magnets to boost their ratings. And, public wants what the public wants. And it is, I had an editor at the Houston Post who thought he was Gus. I mean, he just, he'd be quoting Gus's words of wisdom during editorial meetings and things like that. And I was like, okay, man, you do know that was, a movie, But I mean, look, Larry McMurtry book as your source material. And I say you've got, a great cast. You've got this really movie-sized, epic sweep. I think you could make a strong case that it is the best American Western in any form.
Tonight, CBS invites you and your family to relive a major television landmark. A testament to the opening of the American West, winner of 7 Emmy Awards, an epic adventure. For the last time on network television, CBS presents Lonesome Dove.
All right, so maybe one more question here. So you've just written a list of greatest Westerns, but that doesn't mean favorite Westerns. Oftentimes people can keep those two things separate. Do you have a favorite Western?
The Hired Hand.
Joe?
The Hired Hand. And I know that will, oh, well, he's a child of the 60s and 70s. He was going to say that.
Remembering this great date.
Think about this. Think about this. Here is Peter Fonda right after Easy Rider. He could literally make any kind of movie he wanted to make. And he has just made a movie where he plays, Captain America, the guy, Wyatt, okay? Wyatt Earp, Yep.
Wyatt and Billy, yep.
Which questions, the where America was at that time, where it might be going. And he goes back in time. He's got carte blanche from Universal. He makes a Western. And he makes a Western that even his dad, Henry Fonda, told him, oh, son, that's great. He had, well, why are you casting Warren Oates? He's this, always this wild, crazy guy. And, Fonda said, well, I found this gentleness in, and if you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, he does have this very gentle side to him that very few other directors found or were able to capture it for Warren Oates. And that to me is sort of like encapsulates, in addition to everything else I love about the film. Here's a guy who is a hot property and decides he wants to make a Western. And Fonda told me this on more than one occasion. Peter Fonda told me this on more than one occasion. The Western is a genre, no matter when you make it, can reflect everything about America at any time. And you can tell a story about manifest destiny. You can tell a story about the forming of a community. You can tell a story about men neglecting their women, men defending their women, the relationship between the settlers and Native Americans. And, you can read all sorts of political subtexts and allegories. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. I mean, the Wild Bunch, people say, oh, that was really a metaphor about Vietnam. You have these outlaws going down south of the border and they get involved in a civil war and nothing good comes of this. And that, that's a valid interpretation of the movie. But you can make a Western, and the Western genre is large enough that can encompass just about anything. And I've said this before, and no person I've ever interviewed, no actor, no director has ever challenged me on this. I said, I think anybody who makes movies deep down at some point in their lives, some point in their careers, they want to make at least one example of two genres. Everybody wants to make a Hitchcockian thriller, and everybody wants to make a Western.
And on that note, thank you, Joe Leydon, for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, that about wraps up this episode. But before you go, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Western Podcast. That's at, as in the at symbol, Western Podcast, all one word. Tell us which films appear on your list of the 100 greatest Westerns ever made, and you just might hear us discuss them on a future show. Also, if you enjoy our podcast and want to help support it, the best way you can do that is by subscribing to it on whatever platform you use. Simply click the subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode. Until next time, I'm Matthew Chernoff.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson. And you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.